Welcome to Glasgow and this panel discussion on how we decarbonise our homes and our buildings. My name is Simon Virley. I'm Vice Chair and Head of Energy at KPMG in the UK. Delighted to be your host for the next 30 minutes. And I'm delighted to be joined by Charlie Foster, Managing Director of Real Estate Finance at NatWest, Osama Bhutta, the Director of Communications at Shelter, and Mundie, the Head of Housing at Glasgow City Council. So just to set the scene, we've all heard it's Cities Day here at COP26, and one of the biggest challenges we face is how we decarbonise our homes and our buildings. Now, there are plenty of reports out there about how you do this, plenty of reports on the technologies, but something that was different about the report produced by the Sustainable Homes and Buildings Coalition, which comprises NatWest, British Gas, Worcester Bosch and Shelter, was firstly the diverse group of organisations that came together to produce it, and secondly the real focus on the customer experience and the customer journeys that everybody's going to have to go through if we're to achieve our net zero targets. So without further ado, let's turn to our panellists and hear their remarks, and perhaps I could come to you first, Charlie, to give us the NatWest perspective.
Thanks very much, Simon. And as principal sponsor of COP26 and also strategic partner of the Green Horizons Summit, I'm really pleased to be here representing NatWest in Glasgow. And we've seen a couple of weeks of really intense activity now, and we've all been avidly watching as the negotiations progress. And I'm sure many of us are now keen to get back home and start putting into action the bold pledges that Glasgow has fostered. And action is absolutely what's needed with the built environment, which is the theme for today. There's no net zero pledge that's going to become a reality unless we also address the places where we live and work. And homes and buildings for NatWest is the next frontier for decarbonisation. We've seen lots of commitments coming out around carbon for countries and also for large corporates, but this now needs to turn to the consumer, who is now on the front line. This is the decade where decarbonisation gets personal. And if we want to credibly engage the consumer as representatives from industry, from government, from regulators, then we need to focus on three areas. And the first of those is providing a clear consumer journey. So that means specific personal advice and support. And the second area is looking at adequate consumer incentives that go beyond energy efficiency savings and embrace the full range of mechanisms that are available. So things such as green mortgages, looking at negawatt, and then also things like council tax, just to name but a few. And then finally, cross-sector collaboration is essential. There's no single organisation or industry that's going to be able to manage this themselves. And we've heard quite a lot during COP about the need for private-public collaboration, but this needs to go beyond that. We need to bring in local government. We need to be looking at the various elements of the supply chain. We've got to bring in various industries, finance and energy as too. And all of that needs to work together to raise consumer awareness, to build trust with consumers and address challenges and scale the supply chain. And as Simon mentioned, that was why we formed the Sustainable Homes and Buildings Coalition earlier this year, bringing together British Gas, Worcester Bosch, Shelter and NatWest under one roof. And the focus for the report on home is where the heat is, looking at what is it that's impacting the consumer. And we chose 6 scenarios to explore the consumer experience of decarbonising homes and buildings. And that's not to say the 6 were exhaustive, they absolutely weren't, but it did start to articulate the challenges that are facing the consumer and shows the influence of some of the factors such as socio-economic issues and then also the type of house or building that you actually live or work in. But being consumer-centric has been absolutely at the heart of the Coalition's mandate. We have engaged central government following the release of the heat and building strategy, and part of that dialogue was to look at, well, as we move to the delivery stage of that strategy, assuring that it does accommodate those personal consumer journeys. So regardless of if you're renting a flat in Glasgow, sharing a house down in Dorset or own a listed property in Dundee, you're clear about what it means to green your home. For our next phase, we're really keen to engage with mayors and city leaders to understand what are the limitations in driving decarbonisation at a local level, and are there things that the combined power of the coalition could help to unlock and address. So if you wish to engage, please reach out to us. I think finally, looking at buildings as being the final theme of COP26, I take that as recognition that this is where the hard work needs to start. No net zero pledge is going to be a success unless greening of homes is done in an effective, inclusive, sustainable and fair manner. Decarbonisation is about to get personal, and we must ensure the consumer is at the heart of this. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charlie. So a real important message there about collaboration across sectors. Osama, let's bring you in from a shelter perspective. It's got to be a just and fair transition. How do we ensure it is?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. And look, we at Shelter, we're really proud to contribute to the Coalition's report. As you just heard there, called Home is Where the Heat Is. It's a tremendous report, which not just sets out a vision, but says what's the benefits of that vision, both to the planet and to people, and maps in good detail the journey that we're going to take people or consumers down in order to make those changes to people's homes. At Shelter, we also believe that home is where the heat is, but also home is where the start is. And the report talks about things like the health impacts that houses have on people and subsequently the NHS. So getting that right has health benefits, but home is also the foundation for many other societal factors, such as kids getting a good education if they don't have to worry about the quality and tenure of their homes. Also for people to be able to be entrepreneurial and there's a real get up and go kind of attitude coming from government right now, but if people don't have the security of home, that's very difficult to pull off. So the thing that we would remind people as well is that not everybody is sitting there waiting to have their home retrofitted. They're actually waiting for a home in the first place, and the sharp end of that everyone knows about. The thousands of people in this country who still live in the streets incredibly in a country like ours. 250,000 who are in temporary accommodation or are otherwise homeless. 1.6 million people across the UK on social housing waiting lists. And our research shows that the housing emergency in this country is affecting a staggering 17.5 million people when you factor in things like overcrowding, a lack of affordability as well. And these things are felt not just in the UK, but this is a global phenomenon that we're describing. So we say, yes, that we need to retrofit and modernise our current housing stock, but we also do need to build a new generation of green social homes. And if we're talking about notions like Build Back Better or the Green New Deal, then that's what it's going to mean. It's going to reflect on the lessons of the last 40 years where we went from a greed is good mantra to the disasters which have unfolded. We need to do things in a more humane and people-centred way, and getting everyone into a safe and decent home has to be at the heart of that. There's also this, and I'll finish on this notion that we need a wartime mobilisation now to tackle the climate challenge. And if we draw on that, and we love talking about how this country responded to the war quite rightly, but it was after the Second World War that this country built hundreds of thousands of social homes every single year during the 40s, 50s and 60s. And that's the kind of scale that we're talking about today. We've done it before, and that's exactly what we need to do now.
Thanks very much, Osama. So real sense of that wartime spirit being needed in this next phase of transition to net zero. And also I relate your message about a warm, comfortable home being essential for everything in life, not just this issue, of course. Michelle, bring you in. Delighted to have you here. Thank you for joining us. It'd be great to now ground this in the experience of Glasgow, and you're leading the work here on housing in Glasgow. So tell us about the challenges you see and the opportunities here.
Okay, so I've had a good think about this. Glasgow is absolutely committed to becoming a carbon neutral city by 2030, but we do have challenges. Fuel poverty is a big challenge for the city, and we have about 25% of our households in fuel poverty, and about 11% of them are in extreme fuel poverty. That is where 20% of their income is being used in fuel costs, and that's before the recent gas price rises. So that's a challenge, first of all. In terms of decarbonising the homes, Glasgow has 300,000 houses, and about 76,000 of them are pre-1919. Part of the challenge with the pre-1919 stock is that although there was lots of work done in the 1970s and 80s to comprehensively refurbish these, that work is now coming to an end. So one of the challenges before we start to retrofit properties, we need to look at the actual condition of the buildings in the first place. And there's a cost associated with that, which both tenants and the owners are expected to meet. The second challenge we have in Glasgow is what we would call the challenge of multiple ownership. So we have properties where we have blocks of flats where there's owner-occupiers, there's private landlords, and sometimes social rented tenants all in one block. And they don't always want to participate in refurbishment projects or even repairs projects. And in addition to that, we have challenges with the titles. So you may have within a tenement block 90% of the cost being responsible for the shop on the bottom, and the remainder of the costs being the upper floors of the tenements. And trying to get everyone to agree to pay to do the work is really, really difficult. So those two challenges in itself bring the third challenge, which is about affordability. We have owners or private landlords who perhaps are sitting in negative equity. They have, or they're low incomes or they're low income tenants, and they can't afford to make the repairs or to introduce the energy efficiency work needed to bring their homes up to standard. The cost of some of the work that's required to do the energy efficiency work can be substantial. There are some low cost measures that can take place, but the rest of the work can be fairly substantial. And we have an example of that where we've retrofitted an empty tenement block to passive house standard or EnerFit standard as a demonstration project, but the cost would not be something that a normal household could take on. What we can do is take lessons from that and replicate that across the city, but we wouldn't be able to do that comprehensive retrofit for every single property in the city because the cost would be in the billions. So it's how do we deliver that? The last challenge is just about behaviour. How do we convince our tenants and owner-occupiers and our private landlords that they really need to do this? Because is it more important to have a nice kitchen? Should they be putting their money into that? So how do we convince people that this is really important? And part of that is the council. So as I said, the council has already made a pledge to become carbon neutral by 2030. We have also pledged to tackle fuel poverty. My team have already been working really hard at this. Since 2013, they've already delivered £108 million worth of retrofit work across the city and tackled over 12,000 homes with mainly external wall insulation. But they're single measures, and really going forward, what we're looking to do is move to a whole house retrofit solution. And also with our new build programme, we introduced the Glasgow standard, which is looking at a really high level of sustainability for our new build programme. And going forward, we intend to take that to zero carbon. So.
Thanks very much, Rochelle. So some really challenging issues in terms of the housing stock in Glasgow and the ownership structures and about the cost of the transition.
Absolutely.
Just one of the points made in the report by the coalition was everything has to be locality specific, and I think your examples there really bring that out. Just say a bit more about the role you see for local authorities generally, if we think nationwide about this, because everything has to be locality specific. Presumably local authorities have got an absolutely central role to play in this, helping shape this transition.
And absolutely, and I think it's picking up on your point about trust. Some of the work done in the past has been by cowboys, and they've done a lot of damage, which we've also had to repair to be able to do additional work. So I think the local authorities must take the lead in this. We're really good at partnership working. We're really good at attracting different forms of funding and putting them together in a package to be able to deliver that for owners and tenants. And we've got to continue to do that, but we have to do that on a bigger scale. And we also have to get very clear messages out there about why this is important, but to help support people to do that at the same time.
No, it's a really interesting point about local authorities having that trust element to a greater degree, and so leading that local conversation, I think, is hugely important in terms of building that trust. Thanks very much. You mentioned cost, Michelle. I want to bring Osama back in on this point about cost. Lots of upfront costs. We heard from Michelle there of big upfront costs, often savings down the line, of course, because you've got lower heating bills if you're well insulated. But Osama, just this issue about cost and who pays and how do we make sure it's fair? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and you know, economists and their ilk will be able to talk about this in great detail. But you know, I think there's you know, the orthodoxy in the past was, you know, of straitjackets. We've gone through a decade of austerity. You know, the government has shown in the last couple of years that when there is a need to spend money, that money can be found. And I suspect we'll see the same thing as we tackle the climate emergency and with the full rigor that it needs, you know, going beyond the blah 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 phase to actually thinking in as many different industries. But just in housing, we're talking about, you know, some major implications. You know, how are we going to find all of the workers that are needed to do this? You know, how are we going to train them up? Where are we going to get the materials from? And of course, how are we going to pay for it? So all of these things need to be fleshed out. But I think what we found in the pandemic is that, you know, what you can do, you can afford. And I think the big question facing the country right now and the government is, okay, how are we actually going to do this? I suspect the money will be found in between all these great conversations happening in COP between the finance sector and the government. You know, there's comments around taxation as well. All of these things come into it. But it's you know, once you actually put the plans down, you'll find that way. And I think as a country, we've shown that time and time again.
No, thanks very much. And I guess, Charlie, you know, NatWest, as a big finance provider, there's a big role here for NatWest to help find clever financing solutions to deal with some of those upfront costs. Is that right?
No, absolutely. And I think that it goes beyond just looking at sort of the more obvious side around green mortgages and green lending to fund that retrofit. Is actually also that we can help with scaling that supply chain. And we released a report, the Springboard to Sustainable Recovery, talking about the opportunity for SMEs. But again, there are barriers to those SMEs. So how can we help unlock some of the barriers, which are actually a number of them are not dissimilar to the barriers facing sort of homeowners at the moment around retrofit, in terms of understanding and awareness about what the problem is and where the opportunity then is for these SMEs to step in and support. And I think there's some great innovation that we're seeing with local authority as well around how do we bridge that skills gap and how do we train people up and provide a sort of a long-term career pathway to attract people into these sides of the industry that are absolutely going to need to step up. But it's got to be a collaboration, because there's no point in doing pockets of things, there's no point providing the finance on one element when we're missing the point on some of the other barriers that people are currently facing. But a huge opportunity, so important that that's not also missed as a positive of this.
And what's the key to unlocking that, the positive upside, the green jobs, as you say, and the investment? What's the key that unlocks that? Because, as you say, there's a huge opportunity there, but what would you highlight as the most important factor?
I think probably it's that collaboration and actually speaking to one another, the various component parts, and making sure that it's a joined up consideration of the pathway of all the different parts you need to look. So actually the report, The Home is Where the Heat, is started to do that, where you map things out and find where those barriers are and find out who are the stakeholders and where do we need to be having those conversations, and how can we draw attention to and get the funding and support that we need in place.
And I know your lead on commercial property at NatWest. Is there a difference when we think about commercial properties as opposed to residential? You know, what are the differences or issues that need to be addressed? Yeah,
I actually think that, you know, greening people's homes will be a really important part for people being more on board and understanding about how to address the commercial side. I mean, the commercial side, it has regulation wrapped around it, so that's already in place around the standards of energy efficiency that need to be achieved. But I think particularly at the smaller end, landlords are really struggling again about how do they finance this, how do they understand, who do they go to, who do they trust to do the work, what's the pathway, what does their building mean, and the impact on tenants as well, actually, because you can't necessarily do this with tenants in situ. But I think the really important part, if we can unlock how we green people's homes, a lot of those skills are transferable into the commercial market, and I think it also gives those people then the understanding about what needs to be done.
Osama, let's bring you back in on the policies here, because we've had the heat and building strategy from the government, and it'd be good to get your reflections and Michelle's reflections. How far does that take us further forward? Has that really given us a good platform now to make real progress on this, or are there things you would have liked to see that weren't in that statement from the government?
It is now getting into, and maybe this will happen after COP because there's so much coming into this. There's an opportunity for us as a country to lead the way internationally, which is something that we do like to think of ourselves as doing. And taking the public along with us as well. As you said at the top, a key aspect of this report was how do people feel about this? I don't know how much awareness there is in the public about homes, the percentage of our emissions as a country that are sitting in our homes at the moment, and the pride that people can feel as we go through that journey over the coming years in making them more green, making them more sustainable. And I suspect that's been one of the difficulties in making the agenda real. So why is it, when you look at what is concerning the public right now, the climate challenge is right up there, and that wasn't always the case in years gone by. But in amongst the pandemic, people are very, very concerned about climate change, but they're not exactly sure about what exactly is taking place, and presenting that exciting future to them. Right now people think electric cars and so on, but it's not really got to that home level yet. Or like, what can my home look like? And get excited about it and find ways themselves of doing it. And for those that need help in doing it, whether that's our social housing stock or elsewhere, and of course the new green homes that we need to build. But that's the kind of excitement. And I think when the public see plans like that coming from the government, when those kind of houses are revealed, those houses of the future, then you will see much more momentum between the public, business, the industries that need to build and retrofit this stuff. That's when we'll get that momentum coming.
Trouble is, wall insulation isn't quite as sexy as buying a Tesla, is it? So how do we build that sense of excitement about a positive vision, as opposed to this is something that's got to be done to you in your home? So I'm just interested in your thoughts about how do we build the sense of a positive vision about warmer, more comfortable homes?
I actually disagree. Like, if people can get excited about cars, they can get excited about their homes as well. But no one's done that yet. No one's done that Elon Musk thing of here's what your home's going to look like in 5 years' time. What's the Tesla of the home? And I would say, look, I think that's the challenge to all the architects and the planners out there, is actually show people that this is what your warm, safe, decent home is going to look like in the future.
And who should lead that conversation? I'm going to bring you, Michelle, in just a moment, but I'm intrigued your view. So who should lead it? Is it national government? Is it local government? Is it NGOs? Is it finance community, the installers? Who should it be?
I think it's both. Everyone's got a responsibility. Obviously, government's got a crucial responsibility, but the world is changing, and this is about activating people on the ground, whether that's communities, housing associations, local authorities, as I said, industry as well. I think all of that energy is, the government can't just make the energy itself. It will catalyse it. But if this is going to be successful, everyone's going to own this and be excited about it.
Michelle, your thoughts on who leads this conversation? Is it you for Glasgow?
We've been leading that conversation for the last 10 years. No, I agree. I think it has to be everyone. It has to be a collaboration. It has to be partnership from businesses, from the social housing sector, from government, from national government. And if people will buy into things if they can feel that it will make a difference for them. And if they feel that they're making a difference to the climate. But in addition to that, there's opportunities there for our economy in terms of jobs. If we're going to do all this retrofit, we need people to do that, and that will create jobs. It will create training, and we need to capitalise on that. And when people see that, I think they become more engaged.
And on my question earlier about the heat and building strategy, how much of a step forward was that to see that come out of national government? Obviously, you've got Scottish government support as well and policies that are relevant to you here in Glasgow. But, How much do you welcome that, and how much do you think there is more to do in terms of the overall policy framework?
Absolutely welcome that. It gives a clear direction of travel. So yes, absolutely. There is still more work to do. There's always more work to do. You can't get away from that. It's about how we implement that on the ground and how we take that direction and apply that to the houses in Glasgow. So, and that's our job.
Yeah. Charlie, just a thought in terms of NatWest plans going forward, and indeed tell us a little bit more about the coalition's plans going forward and how all this works, both from a NatWest and a coalition point of view.
So I think probably with the coalition, absolutely looking at working with local government, because there's so much innovation and good work already going on, and actually also best placed to answer about what are the local problems, what are the things that are stopping you from being able to accelerate, and then seeing is there stuff that within the coalition that we can then be doing to focus on those challenges and really help to unlock them. So I think that's our next phase. That's for Q1 of next year to be going around and speaking to these cities and local authorities around their plans and their challenges for this side of things. And then NatWest, I mean, continuing to support, real estate, mortgages, personal homes, commercial buildings, all a huge part of our balance sheet. So absolutely, what can we do to be supporting the transition? But the coalition is a key mechanism for how we engage with the sector more broadly.
And you've got some ambitious targets, haven't you, as NatWest? Your targets for decarbonisation, targets for your lending stock, targets for commercial buildings. Any highlights you want to pick out for us about what NatWest is trying to do?
Yeah, so I suppose around the biggest pledge that we have is absolutely around at least halving the carbon impact of our lending activity, and that's really forced us to look at what drives the carbon in each of those inherent sectors. So it's not just talking about, we've managed to reach net zero for our own operations, but the much more important part is where we're putting the money in and what impact is that money having. So not straightforward. Assessing carbon is an evolving science, but working really hard to at least get that number understood, and then to look at what are the most effective and impactful measures that we can take. And that is the response. There is not we just slash all the funding against anything it's higher carbon producing. It's how do we work with those sectors to help them transition. But absolutely, there's got to be buy-in from both sides about credible pathways. And
is data and measurement a real issue still? Or, I mean, I noticed your survey saying that not many people understand what their EPC is in their own home. Is that still an issue about how we're measuring carbon and indeed energy efficiency? Yeah, and I think translating it into language that consumers understand as well is a big barrier, and also understanding the limitations. So EPC is absolutely a useful measure, but it is only sort of theoretical and it doesn't capture everything. So how do we move that on? How do we improve things? And how do we make sure that those people undertaking the EPC assessments are doing it to a good standard? And then again, yes, translating it back to the owner or the occupier of that building and what it means for them, and what behaviours they can then demonstrate to improve energy efficiency. And Michelle, when you're engaging with residents here in Glasgow, what's the language that works? I've heard there that EPC isn't necessarily a term that translates terribly well, but what's your thoughts on how we actually engage on this topic?
In really broad terms, it's money.
Money.
If we can go to tenants or owners with incentives, financial incentives, and reduce the cost. I'm not saying that owners shouldn't contribute, but sometimes they find that the level of contribution really difficult. If we can go with some grant funding, that really helps.
Yeah. And is there a role, do you think, for tax as well? Because the government, you mentioned grant funding and the importance there, but there are also tax incentives you could have for energy efficiency improvements. Is that something you'd welcome if the government moved in that direction?
Personally, yes. I would. There's no incentive just now for a homeowner when they're selling their property to make sure it's as energy efficient as possible. So yes, absolutely, would welcome a change. Give people some food for thought at the point of sale. Yes.
And regulation as well presumably has a big role to play. We heard in the heat and building strategy, the plan basically to phase out the sale of gas boilers from 2035. Is that part of the toolkit here in terms of giving the supply chain a signal that this is going to change?
We've already been doing that,
right.
Signalling to our supply chain that we will be taking all our new build off gas from 2024. But in reality, we're starting that now. and we're starting to build that up. So absolutely, it's a challenge, but we're up for the challenge.
Okay. Well, it looks like that's all we've got time for. So big thank you, Michelle, Osama and Charlie. Great contributions, great panel discussion. Thanks very much to Green Finance Institute, City of London and the Green Horizons Summit, and goodbye from Glasgow.